Hello and welcome. In this unit, we'll discuss special education eligibility for students with learning disabilities. Our goal in this unit is to 1. Recap how students become eligible for special ed, and 2. Explain the models used to determine eligibility. We'll also discuss some common issues students who have learning disabilities might face as they seek services. So let's begin with a recap. How do students become eligible for special education? In a previous unit, we discussed 3 core requirements that every student must meet in order to be eligible for special education services. Do you remember what they were? Students are eligible for special education if 1. They are less than 22 years of age, 2. They have 1 or more of the following disabilities listed on your screen, and 3. They need special education and related services. As we've discussed previously, these eligibility categories are not medical diagnoses, but are legal definitions developed by lawmakers in the IDEA. When we say a student is eligible for special education under learning disability, we're saying that a student meets the legal requirements for that eligibility. In a few seconds, we'll see what those are. It's also important to remember that some students may have disabilities, but may not require special education and related services. These students would not qualify for IDEA services or eligibility because, as we just discussed, in order to be eligible, the student must need special education and related services. Of course, these students aren't left to fend for themselves. They are protected by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which are topics for another unit. Let's discuss how students with learning disabilities are identified as being eligible under the law for services. Normally, the process is as follows. A student is struggling in school and a teacher or parent notices. The school or the parent will then refer the child for special education. A school psychologist will then assess the student to recommend special education services. An IEP team, including the parents, will then decide whether they agree with the recommendations. If they do, they will develop an IEP document with goals, services, and other parts. Remember, by law, all states must have policies and procedures to ensure that all children with disabilities are identified, located, and evaluated. This is called Child Find, and this is why teachers, schools, and districts should actively be looking for students with learning disabilities, whether or not they're enrolled in school. One important thing that parents must remember is that the assessments that are used to identify students with learning disabilities must be comprehensive. They can cover areas as broad as motor, sensory, cognitive, communication, and behavior needs. They could also assess abilities and skills such as listening, speaking, reading, writing, reasoning, mathematics, and social skills. So let's assume a student has made it this far. How do they qualify for special education services? In order to be eligible for services under the category of learning disability, the law says that a student must meet 2 broad elements. First, the law says that a student should have a disorder in 1 or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language. The language can be spoken or written. The disorder manifests itself in the imperfect ability to speak, listen, think, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. However, it excludes learning problems that are the results of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, intellectual disability, environment, culture, or economic disadvantages. I know this is confusing, so let's paraphrase the law. A student has a disability. This disability affects the use of language, which means speaking or writing. This disability affects how the student reads, writes, etc. If a student meets the elements of what we just discussed, there is still a second part of eligibility they must meet. So what is the second element a student must meet in order to be found eligible for learning disabled? Here, states have 2 options, which are grouped into either severe discrepancy model or an RTI model. Let's talk about the 2 models. First, the discrepancy model. For a student to be found eligible for a learning disability, they must have a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes, as we discussed. Under this model, the disorder must cause a discrepancy between the student's intellectual ability and their academic performance. That is, the student could have scored an A+ on a test because he or she knows all the material, but when they actually take the test, they get a C-. In order for it to be considered a discrepancy, it cannot be corrected through regular classroom services, like tutoring. It's not that the student didn't study enough, they just couldn't do it. If all these elements are present, the student will meet the LD, or Learning Disabled, eligibility requirements under this model. So how do we know that a discrepancy exists? In California, the discrepancy between ability and achievement can be identified through standardized tests, alternative assessments if standardized tests are not valid, and through an IEP team. The team can decide that there is a discrepancy even if the assessments don't show a discrepancy. But this decision must include 1. Assessment data, 2. Parent information, teacher information, evidence of the student's performance in the regular and or special ed classroom obtained from observations, work samples, and group test scores, and 5. Consideration of the student's age, particularly for young children, and 6. Any additional relevant information. Please note, in California, whether or not the student shows a severe discrepancy, they might be found eligible if they do not achieve adequately for their age or meet state standards. In addition, in California, students are not eligible if the disorder is a result of economic situation, environment, culture, lack of school attendance, lack of appropriate instruction, or the student's limited English proficiency. The second model we'll discuss involves using RTI, or Response to Intervention. We have a unit on this topic, so please watch that to learn more about RTI. But briefly, RTI calls for an intervention to be applied across a group of students or the classroom to see if the discrepancy shrinks. If the student responds to the interventions, they may not be eligible for special education because changes to their general education program are sufficient. If the student discrepancy does not shrink, the student is eligible for special education. Please note that RTI can sometimes be used to stall the identification process because it takes many months to apply and observe this intervention. This is especially true for students who have first been referred for special education. A school might say, oh, it's too early to say that they have a disability. Let's try RTI for a few months. Parents have a right to insist that the school follows the law and assess the student for disability. If they want to apply RTI at the same time, that's okay, but let's not allow a delay. With that, we'll end this unit that focuses on learning disabilities and eligibility. You can also access our Special Ed Toolkit online and read Chapter 6 on eligibility for more information. If you're in the Los Angeles area and are having trouble accessing special education services, please call us at the number you see on your screen. Well, thanks for joining for now, and goodbye.